Hitachi Energy is proud to partner with the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Powering Purpose is a new book resulting from the partnership between Hitachi Energy and Monocle. It tells the story of the people and the technology leading the energy transition and ushering in a sustainable and secure future. Hitachi Energy and Monocle work together to provide inspiration on powering people's lives and where to find the energy for change in the era of electrification. Secure your copy now at monocle.com or in store in Monocle outlets around the world. And if you want to understand the role you can play in harnessing connections to ensure a brighter, more sustainable and secure future, head to hitachienergy.com. Hitachi Energy and Monocle, inspiring the energy for change.
On November 7th, Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, just a couple of weeks into the job, fielded a question in Parliament from Katsuya Okada, an opposition MP and former foreign minister. At issue was Japan's range of options in the event of China acting on its long-simmering threat to seize Taiwan. Takaichi said, if battleships are used and a naval blockade involves the use of force, I believe that would, by any measure, constitute a situation that could be deemed a threat to Japan's survival. The Prime Minister's choice of words was important. Under Article 9 of the Constitution imposed upon Japan by its American conquerors after World War II, Japan formally and forever renounces war as an instrument of statecraft. It has been generally understood that, as a consequence, Japan's military, the Japan Self-Defense Forces as they are tellingly known, might be deployed only in absolute extremis. For example, to return to the Prime Minister's words, a threat to Japan's survival. In China, this spectre of Japan's navy steaming to Taiwan's assistance, rising sun flags ahoist, prompted fury. The People's Republic regards Taiwan as a temporarily rogue province, whose reincorporation is a righteous inevitability. Though China always erupts at any suggestion or implication of Taiwanese sovereignty, their response to Takaichi's statement has been spectacular even by the usual picturesque standards. Ambassadors have been summoned, vituperative statements made, even a warning issued of crushing defeat should Japan insert itself in any China-Taiwan conflict. Japan has accused China of twice locking radar on Japanese fighter aircraft, an intimidatory tactic which compels pilots to anticipate incoming missiles. More immediately damagingly, an officially encouraged travel boycott has seen hundreds of thousands of Chinese people cancel visits to Japan and Chinese airlines pruning their Japan services. Did Sanae Takaichi mean to start a row of this magnitude? Might China's response escalate still further? And do we yet understand what China plans to do about Taiwan and when? This is the Foreign Desk.
It's too early, I think, for anyone to draw a lesson from her recent comment. If anything, it just revealed her deeply held political belief.
If the Chinese thought that the Americans would not interfere, they would have taken actions to take Taiwan already.
Chinese very strong opposition, very strong criticism of Japan in the current crisis. It sends a message to others who would want to support Taiwan as openly as Japan did.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is Yuka Roya, journalist for France 24. Yuka, first of all, let's go back to the Prime Minister's remarks on November 7th. Was it instantly clear just how volcanic China's response was going to be?
I don't think it was. I think it took some time before it became clear that China was obviously unnerved by this and angry at this. But I think the Chinese reaction came in fairly quickly. And also the language and the situation where she made the remark. It's important to note that it didn't come from her. She didn't initiate this in a way. It was in answer to a question from the opposition in Parliament. It was incidentally her first sort of question and answer session in Parliament as Prime Minister. And it was an opposition leader who asked her, what would you consider a potential attack on Taiwan? Would you consider it as a survival-threatening situation? That's a term that appears in a law that was passed, I think, in 2015, which allows the Japanese self-defense force to legally act in collective self-defense. And she basically said yes. She said under specific circumstances, when warships started using military force around Taiwan or against Taiwan, that could constitute a survival-threatening situation for Japan.
Is it possible to get any sense of how that landed with the Japanese public? Were people surprised to hear their new prime minister invoking this as a potential scenario?
Yes, the general public might have been surprised to hear that, but at the same time, coming from Takaichi, a long time sort of China hawk, and she was known for being more pro-Taiwan by extension to being pro a China hawk. It wasn't entirely surprising if it came, if it was a remark that she made during a public speech, then I think it might have been a lot more shocking. It didn't go unnoticed, but it didn't spark the kind of shock that it sparked in China.
I mean, what has the public reaction been then to, I guess, China's reaction, which has had fairly severe real-world economic consequences already for Japan and may yet have aftershocks which take some while to be fully appreciated? I mean, all the numbers I've seen about how much economic damage has been done by this tourism boycott that the Communist Party called for are very, very large indeed. Is she going to be blamed for that?
I think the Japanese public is divided. On the one side, there are people who side with her and say, well, she was right in taking a stance against an increasingly aggressive China. And on the other hand, there were people who say that it was at least a diplomatic error. She went too far. Even her predecessor and her mentor, Shinzo Abe, in public, he always kept a more vague, sort of ambiguous stance on China. Having said that, though, Abe did say after leaving office as prime minister, he did say that a crisis in Taiwan could be interpreted as a potential crisis in Japan. And also another Liberal Democratic Party heavyweight, Aso Taro, also said something like there is a high probability that the government should consider that as a survival-threatening situation. So people weren't totally shocked by this. Now, in terms of China's reaction, I think they're only just beginning to see the full impact, especially more recently over the last weekend when there was a run-in over the sea near Okinawa, when Chinese fighter jets locked radar on Japanese military planes. And that's when people started to think, oh, this might be taking the relationship between the two countries to a new low, a level that perhaps hadn't been seen since the Senkaku Island crisis. That's about a decade ago. I think in terms of the economic damage, when China first responded with restrictions on Japanese seafood, import ban on Japanese seafood, well, that ban had been in place and had only been lifted a few months prior to that, during which time Japanese exporters had already diversified their market. So that was taken slightly more lightly than now, in the sense that it didn't have an immediate impact on a Japanese export. But when it came to larger sort of economic exchanges, including tourism, of course, Chinese tourists are the number one in Japan in terms of their numbers, and the purchasing power is quite significant. So the economic damage coming from that tourism sector is probably more significant than the goods trade.
I mean, for all that this is being framed as a kind of an off-the-cuff remark, that this wasn't in a prepared speech, that she was just replying to a question she seemed to have been quite surprised by, is anybody in Japan deriving from this any, I guess, conclusions about what kind of foreign policy prime minister she aims to be?
It's too early, I think, for anyone to draw a lesson from her recent comment. If anything, it just revealed her sort of deeply held political belief. And also, it was off the cuff, but at the same time, it's just emerged. I think it was earlier today that Japanese newspapers started reporting that there was actually a prepared remark by Korea diplomats prepared as an answer to that question. But she diverged from that. She didn't stick to the script. So whether it was deliberate or whether it was accidental is yet to be known. But she did have a more balanced sort of diplomatic, a text that was written in diplomatic language that followed from Japan's long-held stance, public stance at least, on Taiwan, and she diverged from that. And I think that it was indicative of perhaps of what to come. But at the same time, though, she has been walking a fine line. If anything, after being elected, when she was elected prime minister, China was already wary because of her history of being a China hawk. And I think both sides were quite happy to see that at the beginning, in her first face-to-face talks with President Xi Jinping of China on the sidelines of the APEC summit, she did come away from that meeting, relatively unscathed, and they touched upon mutual interest, trade ties, and so forth. So the way that it flip-flopped so quickly after that, I think, has been quite a big shock for especially the business community, you think.
That was Yuka Roya, journalist for France 24. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Joining us now is Steve Chang, director of the SOAS China Institute. Steve, were you surprised by the tone of China's response to the Japanese Prime Minister's remarks the other week? Even by their usual standards, where Taiwan is concerned, they really were very angry.
No, I was not surprised to hear the Chinese response. I think because the Chinese government really does not want to see Japan drift in any way in a direction that takes a robust stance over Taiwan, even though what the Japanese Prime Minister has said does not fundamentally change Japan's long-standing policy, and the Chinese know that.
I mean, we know, we've talked about this before, China has a tendency to go straight from zero to nuclear where Taiwan is concerned. They don't sort of often issue nuanced responses. But are they especially sensitive where Japan is concerned more than other countries? Because, of course, China had to cede Taiwan to Japan after losing the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. Japan has actually been the colonial power in Taiwan more recently than China has.
Well, you are absolutely right that the Chinese government or the Communist Party is particularly concerned and sensitive when it comes to Japan over Taiwan. I think the reference to history is something which they found it very useful to do. But the reality is that Japan is the single most important ally the United States has if and when the United States responds to a Chinese use of force over Taiwan. Because U.S. forces that will engage China over Taiwan will have to operate out of Japanese territories, both on the Japanese main islands as well as Okinawa.
Because one of the things that was interesting about what the Japanese Prime Minister said was this suggestion that in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, it might be something that Japan would feel obliged to respond to as a threat to its own security. Is the possibility of a Japanese response as well as an American one a factor in China's thinking about whether to take Taiwan by force or not? Or do they think of it mostly as we might have to fight America? Do they actually think about we might have to fight Japan as well?
I think the Chinese calculation is pretty clear and consistent that if and when they take Taiwan, they will expect to have to either deter the United States militarily, or they will have to engage with the United States militarily. If the Chinese thought that the Americans would not interfere, they would have taken actions to take Taiwan already. They haven't done so because they calculate that the Americans will interfere. And when the Americans interfere, the US-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty would be triggered, and Japanese territories, which would be used by the US forces, would potentially come under Chinese threat, if not actual attack.
So with that in mind, is it possible that the furious Chinese response that we saw to the Japanese Prime Minister's remarks is kind of a way early in her term of establishing the parameters of the relationship, letting her know, as Beijing sees it, what she can and cannot get away with?
Well, let's not forget that the Chinese Communist Party, particularly under Xi Jinping, has a tendency to see, in quotation marks, a kind of original sins in some of the foreign leaders who are seen as having taken a particularly robust stance towards China. And Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi is one of those who had a record of speaking quite robustly when it comes to China. And therefore, when she articulated what has always been there but not articulated by Japanese senior politicians before, the Chinese government would simply respond very robustly. If it had been said by a Japanese leader who would be considered as a friend of China, they might give that leader a chance to back off. But given Prime Minister Takaichi's background, they simply would have to come down very, very hard on her.
How has this landed, as far as we can tell, with the Chinese public? Because Japan had become an extremely popular holiday destination for Chinese people. 7 million Chinese visitors in 2024. There have been reportedly 500,000 tickets cancelled in the last few weeks since the Communist Party urged Chinese citizens not to go to Japan, not to holiday there, not to go to school there. Does that suggest that the Chinese public are broadly in sympathy with the attitude the Communist Party has taken, or are the Chinese public just doing as they're told?
Well, the great Chinese public are completely schizophrenic when it comes to Japan. On the one hand, as you say, a lot of Chinese are very warmed to a lot of Japanese culture and ideas and ways of life. And at the same time, most Chinese, indeed all Chinese, have been brought up with a diet of almost pathological anti-Japanese hatred, with a regular re-showing of dramas and movies in China and other literature, which would constantly revisit the Second World War and highlight Japanese brutalities during the Second World War, making people in China emotionally hate the Japanese. But we're talking about two very different Japan. Imperial Japan that was very aggressive and brutal, and the post-war Japan, which has renounced the use of force in its own constitution. Most people in China don't know that.
That may change, of course, and Takaichi would not be the first Japanese prime minister to want to change that so that Japan can operate militarily as, for want of a less pejorative phrase, a normal country. Is it fair to say that China, in reacting as it has, is also trying to warn her that China really would not stand for that China would regard that as a matter of serious concern?
Indeed, that is a very important consideration for the Chinese. I think they certainly are making a marker, putting a marker down to show the Japanese, particularly to the Prime Minister, that they would not tolerate a repealing or a substantial revisions to Article 9 in the Japanese Constitution.
Just finally then, assuming Prime Minister Takaichi wishes to repair this relationship, is there any way at all she can do it?
Unless she accepts Chinese terms, there is almost nothing else she could do that would satisfy the Chinese. And because she started off as somebody that the Chinese government did not trust to begin with. So she would have to do much more than a Japanese leader whom the Chinese government would have considered as a friendly figure in Japan to begin with.
That was Steve Chang, director of the SOAS China Institute. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. For a look at the wider strategic picture in the South China Sea and surrounds, I'm joined now by Eva Pashova, Japan Chair at the Centre for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy of the Brussels School of Governance. Eva, if we start with what is probably the big question underpinning all of this, do we think China has actually made up its mind about Taiwan and what it wants to do?
Well, I think China has been kind of consistent about Taiwan. I mean, it aims to reunify with Taiwan or reunite with Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan is, according at least to the Chinese narrative, has always been part of China. So there's no changing mind there.
I mean, do you think they do get concerned, though, when a statement like that one by the Japanese Prime Minister draws further global attention to what they might be thinking about it?
Well, absolutely. In that sense, the Japanese statement stands out because, many countries may think about it, but not that many actually say it up loud, and especially not in a public setting as Prime Minister Takaichi did, which was in a Japanese Diet hearing, right? So in that sense, it internationalizes the question, makes it much more public, and by the Chinese very strong opposition, very strong criticism of Japan in the current crisis, it also sends a message to others who would want to support Taiwan as openly as Japan did. So let's not forget, it's China going around not only publicly criticizing and trying to reach out to individual countries and reminding them about the One China principle, but it's about the economic retaliation that comes with it, right? So let's not forget that the Chinese started to boycott Japanese products, imposing travel bans for its citizens to Japan, or even sanctioning cultural activities, etc. So it's a strong message that whoever wants to join or be as open as Japan did on the Taiwan question will suffer consequences.
I mean, along similar lines then, do you think maybe Japan's, even Taiwan's allies might have preferred that she didn't say anything about it and thereby oblige other people to perhaps make their own statements as well?
And that's a tricky question. I think in the corridors, everyone agrees with what the Japanese Prime Minister said. Honestly, this is nothing new. That a kind of use of force in the Taiwan Strait would be a survival-threatening situation for Japan is a fact. So there's nothing new. And frankly, I mean, from the recent reactions, we can see that Australia was one of the partners that Japan reached out to kind of gather support. All called on China to try to de-escalate, have all voiced pretty much support to Japan. Now I'm referring more on the radar elimination incident that is part of this dispute, right? But other countries keep suffering from various kinds of harassments of China. And in fact, we talked about the Saturday radar incident in the East China Sea, but in the same day, actually, the Philippine fisheries patrol was also fired flares by the Chinese PLA. So, I mean, it's really a common trend that many countries are suffering and are opposing, of course, and are criticizing China to stir up tensions there. So I'm not sure what, we often talk about the US silence about it. I mean, of course, Japan would have probably hoped to get much more vocal support from its key ally. And it was an opportunity to indeed, for Washington to say that it is 100% behind Japan in this path. But it did not criticize it any more than that.
I mean, is it clear that China has, even leaving aside Taiwan, and you're right to point out that it's pretty clear what China actually wants where Taiwan is concerned, even if it's not clear the length that China is willing to go to get it. But in terms of the rest of the region, and you mentioned places like the Philippines, Japan, does China have like an end point in mind, what it would like the region to look like?
Well, in one sentence would be to push the US basically behind the first island chain, right? So Taiwan is undeniably, according to China, a Chinese province. The South China Sea is basically part of Chinese sovereignty or sovereign interests as well. The East China Sea, that there is a dispute over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands that China claims and Japan administers. But all this part of the first island chain where the US has been a guarantee of security, and that is crucial to the US strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific, and that China claims. So in one sentence, it would be to push the United States outside the first island chain and ensure its kind of full sovereignty and influence in everything that lies within that periphery.
And those actions that you mentioned, the things that, the harassment, for example, of Filipino Coast Guard boats, which we've seen quite a lot of, is that part of a policy of China trying to figure out how willing anybody is to stand up to them? Are they trying to find the limits of what they're actually allowed to get away with?
No, absolutely. Absolutely. It's all about that. I mean, in the China-Japan spat, it's really just testing the US-Japan alliance. It is definitely testing the kind of emerging security deterrence architecture in the region, and how credible it is, how willing, how determined it is actually to withstand Chinese pressure.
I mean,
and on the one side, you have Philippines that, it's a sum of weaker countries. The Philippines, of course, cannot completely defend themselves. Japan has its own constitutional constraints. South Korea is yet another question. So all this deterrence architecture is only emerging and largely depends on the United States.
Which I guess does bring us to the ultimate question of whether or not, if push comes to shove, China is actually deterrable.
It depends it depends on many factors. It depends how far it's willing to go. So far, and that's part of the Chinese strategy, it stays below the level of an open conflict. It goes for this hybrid approach. It goes for harassments. It uses a lot of the civilian instruments, being coast guards or its fishing militia in the South China Sea, for instance. It tries to really stay below the threshold of an open conflict, be it, by the way, in Taiwan or the East China Sea or the South China Sea. So it's testing without giving a kind of open excuse or really drive the US allies to actually go into an open conflict.
Eva Peshova, Japan chair at the Brussels School of Governance. Thanks for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.